Good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for Cinco de Mayo. Today is May the 5th, and we are going to be reading together in Numbers chapter 33. Numbers chapter 33. Hope that you've had a great week. Let's finish out the work week today with some good reading here in Numbers, which is going to be just that an absolutely captivating read, which details 40 some odd different stops that Israel makes along the way during their travel from Egypt toward the promised land. There's a lot of just detail here about the travels, but there are also some good tidbits that will draw our minds to some previous events and give us a little bit of new material that they had to keep in mind as they made their way into the promised land concerning some expectations that Yahweh would have for them concerning the land that he was going to give them, this promised land, this great blessing and grace that he was going to give them. We'll read about that towards the end of the chapter. So let's read here together in Numbers 33. Numbers 33, verse number 1. These were the stages of the Israelites' journey when they went out of the land of Egypt by their military divisions under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. At Yahweh's command, Moses wrote down the starting points for the stages of their journey. These are the stages listed by their starting points. They traveled from Ramesses in the first month on the 15th day of the month. On the day after the Passover, the Israelites went out defiantly in the sight of all the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Egyptians were burying every firstborn male Yahweh had struck down among them, for Yahweh had executed judgment against their gods. The Israelites traveled from Ramesses and camped at Succoth. They traveled from Succoth and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness. They traveled from Etham and turned back to Pi Hahiroth, which faces Baal Zephon, and they camped before Migdol. They traveled from Pi Hahiroth and crossed through the middle of the sea into the wilderness. They took a 3-day journey into the wilderness of Etham and camped at Marah. They traveled from Marah and came to Elim. There were 12 springs and 70 date palms at Elim, so they camped there. They traveled from Elim and camped by the Red Sea. They traveled from the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. They traveled from the wilderness of Sin and camped in Dophkah. They traveled from Dophkah and camped at Alush. They traveled from Alush and camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. They traveled from Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. They traveled from the wilderness of Sinai and camped at Kibroth Hattaavah. They traveled from Kibroth Hattaavah and camped at Hazroth. They traveled from Hazroth and camped at Rithmah. They traveled from Rithmah and camped at Rimmon Perez. They traveled from Rimmon Perez and camped at Limnah. They traveled from Limnah and camped at Risa. They traveled from Risa and camped at Kahel-Lathah. They traveled from Kahel-Lathah and camped at Mount Sephir. They traveled from Mount Sephir and camped at Haradah. They traveled from Haradah and camped at Makheloth. They traveled from Makheloth and camped at Tahath. They traveled from Tahath and camped at Terah. They traveled from Terah and camped at Mithkah. They traveled from Mithkah and camped at Hashmonah. They traveled from Hashmonah and camped at Mosroth. They traveled from Mosroth and camped at Bnei Jaakan. They traveled from Bnei Jaakan and camped at Hor Haggidad. They traveled from Hor Haggidad and camped at Jotbathah. From Jotbathah, they camped at Abrona. They traveled from Abrona and camped at Ezion Geber. They traveled from Ezion Geber and camped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. They traveled from Kadesh and camped at Mount Hor on the edge of the land of Edom. At Yahweh's command, the priest Aaron climbed Mount Hor and died there on the first day of the 5th month in the 40th year after the Israelites went out of the land of Egypt. Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor. At that time, the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev in the land of Canaan, heard the Israelites were coming. They traveled from Mount Hor and camped at Zalmona. They traveled from Zalmona and camped at Punon. They traveled from Punon and camped at Oboth. They traveled from Oboth and camped at Ayi Abarim on the border of Moab. They traveled from Ayim and camped at Dibon Gad. They traveled from Dibon Gad and camped at Almon Diblathaim. They traveled from Almon Diblathaim and camped in the Abarim range near Nebo. They traveled from the Abarim range and camped on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. They camped by the Jordan they camped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth to the Acacia Meadow on the plains of Moab. Yahweh spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. Tell the Israelites, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their stone images and cast images, and demolish all their high places. You are to take possession of the land and settle it and settle in it, because I have given you the land to possess. You are to receive the land as an inheritance by lot according to your plans. Increase the inheritance for the large clan and decrease it for the small one. Whatever place the lot indicates for someone will be his. You will receive an inheritance according to your ancestral tribes. But if you don't drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, those you allow to remain will become barbs for your eyes and thorns for your sides. They will harass you in the land where you live. And what I had planned to do to them, I will do to you. And that is Numbers chapter 33. Numbers chapter 33. What we have here in this chapter is the list of the various campsites that span from the time they left Egypt to where we saw them last back in chapter 32. Remember, chapter 32 talks about the Gadites and the Reubenites who wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan. That gives us an idea of where we are here within this chapter. So from leaving Egypt to here, there's a list of 40 places. Now, there's some interesting things about this. Not every single place that we have read about thus far is mentioned in this text. So does that mean that so that could mean then that they didn't necessarily make camp in those places, they just passed through those places, or it could mean that the places that I mentioned are for a specific reason. That very well could be the case. Some have actually gone through and charted out these various places, made them into 3 different columns and rows and such, and have made and have recognized various patterns within these particular places. That's just beyond the scope of our reading here. Maybe in a Bible class we bring those out just because we have more time to dissect that. But just know that there does seem to be some reason between what is found here, the way that these particular stops are organized. Just think about that. Verses 3 through 18 cover a good chunk of text, actually, that begins in Exodus 12 and goes through about Numbers 12. Chapters 18 through 36, or excuse me, verses 18 through 36 serve as another chapter. Not as well organized, doesn't exactly cover an exact space like the previous one, although verses 31, 32, and 33 are a pretty clear echo from Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verses 6 and 7. And then verses 37 through 49 cover the text of Numbers 20 through 22. So we see that here. And then just to finish out looking at the construction of this text, probably verse 50 would be probably a good chapter break, honestly, because right there, beginning in verse 50 of chapter 33 and going through the end of Numbers, we're going to have a number of laws concerning the land, whether it be the way they are to conduct themselves within the land, as we see here in the rest of this chapter, or there's boundaries that are talking about in 34. The Levite cities are mentioned in chapter 35, and then chapter 36 is going to give us some details concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Remember, we mentioned him and his 5 daughters. He had no sons, so they asked what they should do about their father's inheritance so that it would not leave the family. That's given more detail in chapter 36. So thinking about just the first section, verses 1 through 49. Why is this mentioned? Why would it be that Yahweh instructed Moses? That's what the text says. This is not something that was just randomly happened. This was something that Yahweh told Moses to, told him to write down the starting points for the stages of their journey. Why? Well, some people think that this was really Moses almost writing his own obituary, writing all of the accomplishments that were achieved during his leadership. Look at all these different places that Moses led the people to camp out. And certainly, for them in making camp was a big ordeal. It was breaking down the living arrangements for all these hundreds of thousands of people. It concerned the tabernacle as well. Just a lot going on here. But secondly, and probably most importantly, this would remind the people of these are all the places your ancestors went, and recognize that Yahweh took them all the way, that he was with them all the way, that all these different places and all the various obstacles that they had to overcome, Yahweh was with them all along the way. And if he was going to be with them throughout this journey, then recognize he's surely going to be with you as you enter into the promised land. And that makes a lot of sense whenever you consider the end of chapter 33, whenever he gives them instructions that whenever you do cross in, not if you cross in, but when you cross the Jordan into the land, you must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. You must kick them out. Now, some with modern sensibilities might say, well, that's just how wrong of these people to come in and to just take this land from these other people. That's their land. That doesn't belong to them. Well, that's not exactly true. It all belongs to Yahweh, and it was by his sovereign decree that he promised it to the descendants of Abraham. And also, oh, by the way, these are pagan, idolatrous people, and God has every right to punish them by expelling them from the land. He has the right to do so. And that really gets to, it's not just that they're to kick them out, but they're to destroy their stone images and cast images and demolish all the high places. Get rid of this paganism. Get rid of this idolatry. Whenever you do that, then you'll have the land, and you need to sort it out depending on the tribes. The larger tribes get more land. The smaller tribes get less land. This is what you need to do. But verse 55, but if you don't drive the inhabitants out of the land before you, those you allow to remain will become barbs for your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land where you will live. And unfortunately, this is not just a warning, but this does become one of those prophetic type of warnings, because this is certainly what happens, and how unfortunate it is that the Israelites do not listen to the decree of Yahweh here through Moses, that they fortunately don't completely eradicate the land of its previous inhabitants. And we'll see all along the way as we continue our read where some of those failures come back to nip them in the rear end and cause them a lot of issues. So a couple of things to think about then. Number one, just looking at this great list, here's everywhere that God has taken them. Number two, take time to rid yourself of these possible problems in the future. Go ahead and kick them out so you don't have to deal with them. So for us, I encourage you, just think about your own life. Think about your own life and kind of map out in your own life everywhere you've been. And then think about how God has been with you all along the way up to this point. Maybe even in times where you were not living for him, you might be able to see where he was still with you and helping you, even in your rebellion, to get you to where you are today. That certainly is a real thing that God does. He continues to provide for people in general who are made in his image so that they might recognize him and seek to live for him and serve him. But then secondly, I encourage you to think about things in your own life as well that you've had to just kick out. And maybe think about times whenever you recognize this is something you need to rid from yourself, and yet you didn't do that, and how it came back again to cause you problems in the future. So let's take these issues here, these subjects from chapter 33. Again, God being with the people all along the way on their journey, and then ridding ridding themselves of the people. Let's take those and apply those to ourselves and think about the lessons that we can learn in our journey and in our need to rid ourselves of those things that certainly could and do end up being barbs and thorns in our sides. I appreciate you tuning into this reading on this Friday and hope you'll do so again for tomorrow's reading as we read together in Numbers chapter 35. We'll read about the boundaries of the promised land tomorrow, and then we'll finish up on just a couple more readings, 35 and 35 on Sunday, and then Monday a short reading in Numbers 36. And I believe that means that let me double check here. I believe that means that we'll be starting Deuteronomy on Tuesday. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick so I can confirm that with you without speaking out of line here. Let's see. Come on, computer, work with me here. There we go. Let's see here. Deuteronomy chapter 1. Nope. Nope, that is correct. Actually, I just realized I made a mistake on here. Let's see. Saturday. No, I didn't make a mistake. I forgot that I start the reading on Sunday. So Sunday is actually going to be a two chapter read. So tomorrow we're going to read 34, and then Sunday we're going to read 35 and 36. Monday is going to be a catch-up day. Monday's going to be a catch-up day. And then Tuesday, we will begin in Deuteronomy chapter 4. So it actually all comes out in the wash. We're still going to begin reading on Tuesday in Deuteronomy chapter 1. Looking forward to starting a new read in that new text then. Again, thanks for tuning in today. Have a great rest of your Friday, everyone. See you tomorrow as we read together from from Numbers chapter 34. Get ahead of myself now. Normally I'm behind. This time getting ahead of myself. Tomorrow we'll be reading from Numbers 34. Take care. God bless.